Have you heard the story about the man who walks into a bar with his little Jack Russell? And so he sits down on a stool and puts his little Jack Russell on another stool beside him. And so the barman asks, "So what will you have to drink?" The man says, "I'll have a beer." And the Jack Russell says, "I'll have a margarita." So the barman is shocked and says, "Did your dog just speak?" And the man says, "Yeah, he's a talking dog." The barman is fascinated. So he turns to the dog and says, "Wow, as a talking dog, I'm sure you've had quite an experience of life. Could you just tell me something more about it?" And the dog takes a sip of his margarita and says, "Yeah, sure. I have seen some action in Iraq and Afghanistan. After that, I married an actress. I made a few movies, written a few books, and now I tour the world giving talks." And the barman is surprised and shocked out of his wits. And he turns to the man and he says, "Listen, do you understand how much money we can make out of your talking dog? How about we host him here, and for every single person who comes to hear him talk, we charge them $10. What do you think about that?" And the man says, "No, that's too much. Maybe $1." The barman is shocked. $1? Why? But he's a talking dog. The man says, "Yeah, but half of what he said are lies." Is lying ever justified? Is lying ever justified? Was the dog justified in telling lies? It had an amazing ability. Imagine you were in a situation where someone had invited you for dinner at their place, and they served you this meal, and it's the most terrible food you've ever tasted in your entire life. I mean, you're just like one short step away from throwing up. It is horrible. And they ask you, "So how's the food?" Are you, are you justified in lying in that situation? Or let's say you have a colleague or a good friend of yours or someone who sits next to you at work, and they have a real problem with their bad breath. They've got halitosis. And you ask yourself, should I tell this person that they have this issue or not? Because keeping it to myself and just acting as though I'm absolutely comfortable around them could be a kind of lie in my actions, wouldn't it? Or another situation, which happens to very many married men, where your wife is shopping for clothes or you're getting dressed to go out, and then she asks, "Do I look fat in these jeans?" Are you justified in lying in that situation? We all know the saying that honesty is the best policy, but in these three situations, you have a colleague who's got bad breath, or you've got your wife asks you, "Do I look fat in these jeans?" Or you've gone out for dinner and the meal is terrible, and your hosts ask you, "How is the meal?" Is lying justified in that situation? How do we apply the idea that honesty is the best policy to these tricky situations? How do we be honest? How do we be truthful without hurting someone else's feelings? Obviously, we would probably think to ourselves, let me just try and get out of this as quickly as possible. So if my wife or my girlfriend were to ask me, "Do I look fat in these jeans?" Maybe the first response is to say, "No, no, 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 you look great, you look fantastic." I do think that those situations where we think that maybe I should tell a lie, maybe I should tell a fib, a little white lie and get out of it, are actually invitations to grow in our relationship with the people around us through practicing the virtue of honesty or the virtue of sincerity. And I came across a very interesting quote about this virtue of honesty or sincerity from St. Thomas Aquinas, who writes about it in the Summa Theologica. Now, the question is, he poses a question whether truth is a virtue or truthfulness or sincerity is a virtue. And so he starts by posing an objection to it, saying that truthfulness or sincerity cannot be a virtue because all virtues, all moral virtues, are the middle ground between something, too much of something or too little of something. But when it comes to truthfulness, the more one tells the truth, the better. So one can never be too truthful. Therefore, truth is not a virtue. So that's the objection he gives to it. Then he goes on to give a reply to this theoretical objector who has posed this objection that truthfulness or sincerity cannot be a virtue. And I think in the reply he gives, we can find the key to answering this question of, does it ever make sense to tell lies, especially if we need to save face, get out of a tricky situation, or we're going to hurt someone's feelings. Listen to what St. Thomas Aquinas says. He says, I'm quoting from Summa Theologica, on the part of the act to observe the middle ground is to tell the truth when one ought and as one ought. Excess consists in making known one's own affairs at the wrong time, and deficiency in hiding them when one ought to make them known. And he leaves it at that. But let's unpack this a little bit. So, for instance, that situation where your wife or your girlfriend asks you, "Do I look fat in these jeans?" One could think you could think to yourself, "All right, let me just say yes or no," or of course you wouldn't say yes. Bad idea. Bad idea. Don't say yes. But I think that question is an invitation to create a space for a slightly more meaningful conversation. And perhaps the way to initiate that conversation is to follow on with another question and to ask her, "I don't know, what do you feel about the jeans? Do you like them or don't you like them? If you don't like them, what don't you like about them?" Because in many situations, I think they could be just thinking aloud, and then we end up putting our foot in it as men. And it's more a situation of creating the space for them to think aloud, to carry on the conversation. And probably they've already made up their minds about whether they like it or not. And I just need a sounding board to think aloud in that situation. So one could open that space by asking, "I don't know, what do you think about them? Do you like them? Do you think they go with anything else that you have that you want to wear?" But over and above that, going back to what St. Thomas Aquinas says, it's also about the when to observe truthfulness or sincerity. The timing has a lot to do with how truthful or how honest we can be in any situation. So rather than just telling a lie and a fib and just washing our hands of it, I think it also got to do with creating the opportunity or creating the time or creating the occasion when one can delve deeper into that conversation. So going back to the whole conversation around the jeans, do I look fat in these jeans? I think it could be very wise to follow up later in a more quiet setting, a more peaceful environment, not in the changing room at a mall, but at home or in a quiet setting, and to ask, are you uncomfortable with your weight? Are you more concerned about what your sister or your best friend, did someone say something about your weight? Are you comparing yourself with them? But to open up that space again, to go a little bit deeper into someone's insecurities and have them to speak and have them welcome them to speak about it. And I think these heart-to-heart conversations really are at the core of all social relationships, especially those that have to do with friendship. And I wanted to read a quote about these conversations which we expose a part of ourselves where we're really vulnerable, truthful, and sincere to other people. Found a fantastic quote about it in this awesome book called How to Speak, How to Listen by a man named Mortimer Adler. Awesome book. I'd really recommend that you read it. But I just wanted to read a little excerpt about the heart-to-heart conversation and why it is so important for relationships. It's a bit of a long quote, but bear with me. It's worth it. "The communion that can be achieved by human conversation is of great significance for our private lives. It unites the members of a family, husbands and wives, parents and children. It is the spiritual parallel of the physical union by which lovers try to become one." Please note that I did not say the communion achieved by human conversation. I said rather the communion that can be achieved by human conversation. Human beings sometimes, in fact, too often, fail to achieve it by their failures as speakers and listeners in two-way talk, especially in personal heart-to-heart talks. When they fail, the sexual bond that unites husband and wife, and accompanied by spiritual communion, usually fails to preserve their marriage. Divorce as frequently results from the failure to communicate intimately in heart-to-heart talks as it does from the weakening of the sexual attraction. One kind of intercourse without the other kind of interchange between spouses is less than completely human. Nor is it enough for them to be able to converse intimately about personal or emotional matters. A marriage not enlivened by sustained conversations about a wide variety of subjects from which there results a meeting of minds in understood agreements or disagreements has vacuums or voids in it that need to be filled to give it vitality. Something similar can be said about the relation of parents and children. The so-called generation gap is just such a void or vacuum created by failures in communication between the young, especially adolescents, and their parents. The most obvious sign that the barrier that adolescents erects between them and their parents has been overcome lies in the fact that they are once again able to talk freely and frankly with their parents. Such communion reunites them after adolescence has separated them. When that does not happen, a permanent estrangement prevails in its place. The broken home, the split up family, whether it occurs through the divorce of husband and wife or an estrangement between parents and children, testifies that conversation has completely deteriorated, if it ever truly existed. Same applies to friendships, not just parents and children or husbands and wives. The same applies to friendships. So I think each one of these situations, which we spoke about right at the beginning, where the food is terrible, or your wife or your girlfriend asks you, do I look fat in these jeans, or your colleague has a bad case of halitosis, each one of them opens up a situation where we can have a heart-to-heart conversation with someone. And it's really important, absolutely vital, and we shall go into this in the next talk, to create the necessary time and space for it, to create the proper occasion to be able to go into this conversation. So if your colleague has bad breath, it doesn't make sense to stand up in front of everyone and shout at the guy and listen, I've had it with that awful breath. Here's some mints, here's some whatever, please, I can't take it anymore. No, it's a question of being able to pull him or her aside when no one else is listening, when no one is watching, and saying, listen, do you have a few minutes? I just wanted to speak to you about something rather sensitive. Now, and if they say yes, then you tell them, okay, so here's the thing. I don't know what you think about, or what are your thoughts around. Have you ever noticed that you perhaps suffer from halitosis or bad breath? Has anyone ever brought this up to your attention? Have you ever noticed it? And from there to carry on the conversation. Most of the time, when these difficult issues are broached in this way, no one's feelings are actually damaged or hurt, and the relationship deepens. So I think this is a key to practicing sincerity in every situation. It's a lot about understanding when to practice sincerity and how to practice sincerity. It's not a question of avoiding it, but rather a question of creating the occasion to delve deeper into these issues.